And thank you all for coming. Have you ever had to flee your home because you had nothing to eat? It's a challenging question here at this conference center where food is so abundant. Have you ever been a refugee? In the days when the judges ruled, what story does that bring to mind? This is a story about refugees. Elimelech. Is that an issue?
Just switch it in case it's okay.
Elimelech took his wife Naomi from, ironically, the house of bread to an enemy territory because they had nothing to eat. And tragically, when they're in this foreign land, Naomi is widowed. The only person to provide for her is gone. But she has 2 sons. But we find in this story that Naomi ends up alone, left without her husband and her 2 sons. And one thing that hadn't occurred to me until recently as I've been meditating on the book of Ruth in preparation for the final phase of a YWAM training program I'm a part of, it never occurred to me that Ruth and Orpah, I think one got a better name than the other, are also widows. We always talk about Naomi the widow. And we often forget that Ruth herself is leaving her land, going with Naomi, also as a widow. So 3 completely destitute widows. Who will care for them? Who will defend them? Who will rescue them from their plight? I've often thought what Naomi said is very stupid. She says to Ruth and Orpah, "What, do you think you're going to go with me and I'm going to have sons and they're going to grow up and care for you?" What a ludicrous thought. But Naomi perhaps had in the back of her mind the notion of a protector, a redeemer, someone who would defend. But the situation is so hopeless that Orpah goes back to her home, but Ruth makes that commitment to go with Naomi. 2 widows. This bitter experience, as Naomi refers to it, and they return home, and you know the rest of the story. So now for my introduction, but don't forget the story. I would prefer that we not just talk about oral translation or sign language translation or written translation or other kinds, but have a sense, if we do use those terms, that what we're really talking about is multimodal translation. So we open our minds and thoughts to multimodality in translation, and we don't have these divides between the different approaches, but we see them all as a unified whole, and that principles and procedures and methodologies and pedagogies need to flow between the kinds. In this discussion of key terms, it throws us into that discussion of what is referred to as linguistic relativity. Was the conceptual world of the Hebrew Bible, of the speakers of Hebrew in that time, determined by that language? To what extent does language influence or determine how we think? And we're caught in this debate when we think about key terms and the lexical gaps that Dick already alerted us to. And throws us into also this whole discussion of translatability or the untranslatability of different terms. And I'm always surprised by these words that are identified as being untranslatable, like sobremesa, which means different things in different parts of Latin America, by the way. The definition given here is the time spent after lunch or dinner talking to the people you shared a meal with. Well, I want to say, excuse me, you just translated it. You just translated this untranslatable word. So what's up with this notion of untranslatability? But one of the issues, and I think Dick's mention of these lexical gaps is one of the things we need to always keep in mind. Of course there will be lexical gaps. And one of the reasons that you might ask, why would I prefer to talk about key concepts rather than key terms, is I'd like to break that expectation that we're looking for an equivalent term. We need to find the ways to express the concept, which will involve words or terms, but we need to not have that expectation that there will be an equivalent term. So there are a lot of different tributaries flowing into my thoughts. Any of you who have heard previous presentations of mine may be familiar with that. Tegmemics. Let's bring back some things from perhaps a few years ago and training periods for some of us. Had the privilege of knowing Dr. Pike and appreciating his work and knowing him as a very gentle, inquisitive person who visited some Mapuche homes in Chile with us when he was in Chile to speak at the Chilean Linguistic Society meetings. And just amazing to see him sitting on a log over beside an open fire, talking with our friends. Tegmemics. Grammatical analysis, linguistic concepts, fascinating books. And one of the things that I have always taken away from this approach is one of the things that they say about words, that they are isolatable. And that's one of the things that we often experience when we hear another language that we've never heard before. We have no clue where the word breaks are. Everything's just a constant flow. Well, we need to remember that there's this, in this tegmemic approach, there's the discussion of what is referred to as particle, wave, and field. And in the discussion of etic and emic, you know that there's an etic perspective, and those trained in linguistics, like some of us strange people are, hear and identify things in languages that we hear that speakers of those languages and others who are not trained to pick up on things don't hear. But we need to never forget that there's more than just the particle. There's more than just the isolatability of words. We have the wave, we have the field, and I think Pike had identified some incredibly important concepts in this approach. But we need to realize that these are very different perspectives with different purposes. The etic has its purpose. The emic also has its purpose. So the analyst can pull out some of the etic things, and with a recognition of the emic system in which the speaker is living. And sometimes we need to realize that the speaker may never reach a position of an analyst who can identify the etic. And we also need to realize that as analysts, we will never attain the emic level of understanding. And but they're complementary or different perspectives that have different purposes. And one of the things I want to say is words are not just things hanging out there without context. So gleaning. Have you used the word gleaning in the last day? Words are not just these isolated things hanging out there without context. They're interconnected points of entry into worlds of meaning. And some of the influences in this way of thinking have come from cognitive linguistics and the incredible learning that is there in terms of words in use, words in context, lexical pragmatics, and the notion of echoic or attributive concepts. Does anyone in this room suffer from fibromyalgia? Okay. Have you ever used the word? Yes. Do you fully understand what fibromyalgia is medically and experientially? No. Neither do I. But I can use the word. And I have enough of the surface of meaning that I can connect it to other networks of meaning of medical words, but I don't have the depth of experience. So I might just have a kind of dictionary meaning without the full encyclopedic entry that others in the medical profession and those who suffer from this syndrome have. Also, the work of conceptual metaphor is incredibly important in this whole discussion of key terms. The work of Lakoff and Johnson in Metaphors We Live By, and all the things that have followed in the work of Johnson alone and others through that whole school of thought, and I recommend it to you very highly. I'm not obviously going into a lot of detail in these theoretical perspectives, but just want to show some of these tributaries of thought that are flowing into what I will be presenting. Lexical priming. How many of you have read Thinking Fast and Slow? One of the fascinating things in that is a discussion of priming. And for example, if we were to go to lunch and along the way see a sign that advertises a certain food item, one of the aspects of priming or one of the concepts of priming would say that we would be more likely to choose something to eat for lunch that's connected to that advertisement because we have been primed. So this idea of priming is like that water that you put down the pump to get the water flowing. So lexical priming, going to gleaning. Gleaning really makes a lot of sense in a grain growing context. It's not really used much outside of that context. So this is a context where gleaning would have made sense. It didn't make sense in the fields of wheat that we used to harvest on our farm because who would bother? But when you're dependent on a few morsels for your survival, all of a sudden gleaning becomes incredibly important. So context is enriched and deepened through story. So what is lexical priming? Let's glean some thoughts from my recent reading. The notion of semantic priming is used to discuss the way a priming word may provoke a particular target word. And as a word is acquired through encounters with it in speech and writing, it becomes cumulatively loaded with the contexts and co-texts in which it is encountered, and our knowledge of it includes the fact that it co-occurs with certain other words in certain kinds of contexts. One of the significant aspects of this is, for the discussion of key terms, is I fear, and I've been involved in numerous discussions of key terms, I fear that one of the things, because of our tendency to focus on the analytical, we expect people who live in a more narrative, story, rich world of experience to understand concepts or terms with no context. So like the previous slide with the words hanging on signs, I think we need the analytical. I affirmed that point in Dick's presentation, that we need a balance of the two. But how do we then communicate? How do we then speak the language of those who will not connect with the analytical directly, but need that analytical information communicated in story? And my hope in starting with the comments about refugees and Elimelech and Naomi will actually prime you for thinking of other things related to some concepts there. In Becoming a Translator, Douglas Robinson, I'm not going to read this entire selection here, but he talks about a methodological shift from a pedagogy that places primary emphasis on conscious analysis to a pedagogy that balances conscious analysis with subliminal discovery and assimilation. And this methodological shift, if we agree with it, or if we don't agree with it, it also raises questions. And one of the questions that I have been asking myself is, in this thing we call translation, in whatever mode you happen to practice it, there are different kinds of linguistics and different kinds of linguistic knowledge. Through the years, there's been a lot of discussion of, well, we don't really focus on theoretical linguistics, we do applied. There's historical, comparative, descriptive, neuro, psycho linguistics. and hopefully it doesn't turn us into any of these things. And some are more help than others. I don't think we have many colleagues who have only focused on historical linguistics as their, because they're committed to Bible translation. And so what are some of these fields of linguistics that will best provide us the resources we need to help people translate well? And I think some of us settle into things like sociolinguistics, cognitive linguistics, ethnolinguistics, etc., because of the ways they keep culture and language together. And we recognize that that is always a value and a necessary thing. But how many of us in our training have had much exposure to semiosis, or the school of semiotics? Not just semantics looking at meaning, but the meaning-making process of how God created us to be meaning makers. He created us to be interpretive beings in this world. So there's the Persian triangle. I recommend things written by Peirce and others who have interpreted him, who have tried to make meaning out of Peirce. But we realize that we do language, or we could just use the verb, we language, not languish, but language, in full, holistic, embodied contexts. Words are not the everything. They're just pointers to concepts, to encyclopedias of meaning and experience. And semiosis or semiotics helps us grasp the hermeneutical nature of translation. And Umberto Eco, you may be familiar with some of his novels. One of the great semioticians says we want a unified approach to every phenomenon of signification and or communication. And he proposes to define as a sign everything that, on the grounds of a previously established social convention, can be taken as something standing for something else. That's pretty broad. But signs are not limited to the orthographic squiggles on paper. Many things are signs. And many things are involved in our rich understanding of and use of the communicative ability that God, the God who speaks, has given us who speak in our reflection of his nature. We also need to consider epistemologies and ways of knowing, the tacit, the implicit, contrasted with explicit. Michael Polanyi's work in the tacit dimension, not a linguist, a philosopher, who has, I think, dealt very well with some language issues. One of the things he says is, we know more than we can tell. A student in Chile once asked me, "Oh, Prof, could you tell me the difference between the English verbs realize and notice?" I was stumped. I realized there's a difference, but I really hadn't noticed it. Okay, come on, give me the difference. I've pondered that for years. And you have to stop and think about it, because this is part of our tacit knowledge, our use of English. And to be expected to articulate that is beyond the ability of the language user as a tacit user of language. There's also whole part, holistic, atomistic, intuitive, analytical, and again, we would go back to some of the things that Pike identified and the particle wave and field approach, but incredibly significant in our understanding of what kind of linguistics and what kind of linguistic knowledge really helps the translator who speaks that language at a level we will never attain. What kind of linguistics and linguistic knowledge facilitates the translation process? Some things from the whole part whole approach to learning. The model is effective because it encourages training or instruction. It gives learners an overview of what they are about to learn, drills down to the specifics, and then integrates the new knowledge or skills into a broader framework. Learners are presented with a global picture of the parts of information, and the global perspective is repeated with application. This whole part whole inspired format develops the learner's cognitive skills on all levels: knowledge, comprehension, application, analysis, synthesis, and evaluation, leveraging the learner's newly acquired skills to reinforce the understanding of the overall concept. So what I want to emphasize here is, before we go to the parts, before we go to the pieces, let's make sure the whole is there. And do some parts, do some pieces, fill in some gaps. So I would agree with Dick that a mere narrative approach is not adequate. We need the dialogic discovery. And many of those working in orality have pointed out these kinds of things in communicating Christ through story and song, orality in Buddhist contexts. The authors say, why are stories so effective? They touch us at multiple levels, affecting not only our cognitions, but also our senses and emotions. Listening to a story, we're drawn to characters or repulsed by them. We hear sounds, we feel textures, we smell scents. So not just story, but embodied experience. I've been very encouraged by what I would call the embodiment turn in many fields of study, and I think it's bringing us back to a more holistic image of God-based approach to many things. Experience. I'll give his name, Bill Biven, a friend, translation consultant in the Americas, did a very interesting thing, and these are not pictures from Guatemala where he did this, but just to stimulate thinking. What you harvest from those vineyards. And Bill did a very interesting thing with a group of translators in Guatemala who didn't know anything about vineyards, winemaking, anything related to the words that they were expected to translate. And so, as I said, these are not pictures of his process, but he bought grapes, bought things to crush the grapes in, took them through the whole process of making wine. And I thought, what a perfect example of not just expecting someone to look at that key term and a definition, but give them an embodied experience. And you might say, well, wine, that's a pretty minor example, but have we really thought about ways to create story, create narratives as the way to build context for other things? As Hofstadter says in his interesting book, Surfaces and Essences, the human ability to make analogies lies at the root of all of our concepts. And so even with that winemaking example, I'm sure in the minds of all those translators and potential consultants, they were already making analogies to a lot of things in their own experience and enriching that concept, letting that concept ferment in their minds. Priming. I hadn't planned to say that, but the context primes us. And this is one of the things we need to keep in mind with lexical priming and key terms. We can't expect the best key terms to emerge if the speakers aren't primed. In making disciples of oral learners, one of the things that the authors say is that 90% of the world's Christian workers presenting the gospel use highly literate communication styles. They use the printed page or expositional, analytical, and logical presentations of God's word. And the point is that these things often don't connect to those who see and hear and live in a different world. Don't throw the book at them. Another very similar kind of treatment of these concepts, but focusing in this section of the book on the group orientation of many oral preference learners. And how many times have we, in the analytical approach, sorry, it's our son. How many times in our analytical approach have we asked communal-based, community decision-making people to make individualistic exegetical choices? So they say here, as we examine further the characteristics of oral people, we will see just how thoroughly this primary characteristic of group orientation permeates each one. There's been a lot of good movement toward teamwork and translators working as teams, but I tend to believe that we need to promote community-based discovery, dialogic discovery processes, not just for translation, but for enriching the context out of which key terms can emerge. And just quickly, cultural memory is the deep well out of which the waters of story are drawn. Can you imagine a good storyteller who knows absolutely nothing about their culture? The best storytellers know how to pull all of those strings and do the things that will get the reaction. And I fear that so many times in discussions of key terms, we're asking people to deal with concepts and words that are hanging on those wooden signs, and they don't have that deep well of cultural memory that out of which those terms come. And we need to find ways to build this, because story creates the context. So a key term in Ruth, Goel, the kinsman redeemer. I would suggest this is not just a key term, but a complex cultural concept. And I hope that some of our understanding of Goel was enriched or deepened to some degree by thinking about the tragedy of being a refugee, a widow. Who's going to protect me? Who's going to defend me? And I think her expectation, or the comment about, am I going to have sons who will grow up and protect you, comes from that deep cultural well that Naomi had, this understanding of Goed. Who will be there for me? And how can we expect translators in other societies who don't have any connection to that concept? How can we expect them to just out of thin air, so to speak, build or come up with terms that, as Dick said well, that will allow the entrance to the rich cultural meaning? So just a couple things on cultural memory studies quickly. So I would like to end now with just a mention of part of what's being developed in the YWAM training course. The final session that we'll have in January will include a course being titled Translation as Local Practice, promoting community-based methodology. And we want to include the poets, the storytellers, the songwriters, the grandmothers, and those recognized as users, good users of their language, and go through a dialogic discovery process. And so everyone in this process would be trained to know how to create this story around the text with a holistic internalization process using a kind of whole part whole exegesis, and then a focus on translation competence as the basis for a lot of this, learning how to translate well. In summary, I think we need to have, even in the discussion of key terms, a focus on holistic, communal, holistic meaning-making processes. And hopefully the things from cognitive linguistics, conceptual metaphor, lexical priming, semiosis, all inform this meaning-making process. And we need to trust the tacit knowledge of speakers, translators. Embodiment is central to multimodal translation. So let's make wine. Let's experience. Let's do things that will enrich the concepts in an embodied way. And because story and experience prime our cognition for the emergence of analytically inaccessible expressions. Thank you.
Yeah, very thought-provoking presentations. We have about 5 minutes for question and answers. Yeah, and I hope if you have more questions, please feel free to meet with Dick and Brian. Those who would like to ask questions, you can raise your hands and we'll bring the mic to you. And please address the question to whoever you would like to direct, either to Dick or to Brian.
Thank you both for those excellent presentations, both contrastive in very interesting ways, very helpful. A question for Dick on your presentation. You expressed the concern, at least that's the way I received it, in looking at the oral stories that you looked at from a consultant point of view, certain missing key terms or missing concepts that were not there. And but how do you understand the oral Bible translation process? You know, yesterday I alluded to this notion that when you do oral translation, you add things and you lose things. From a consultant's point of view, how do you view this notion in orality that of adding and losing in an oral text that's based on a written text?
I think in general, any kind of translation, you lose some and you add some. So that's not just for oral Bible translation. So I think we are aiming to be accurate, or to have a resemblance of meaning that is as close as we can get. Something that we are aiming for. And so I'm very excited about oral Bible translation because it helps us to be more consistent in actually, having this oral mindset. And I think my concern is that, and this of course will depend on the situation. If it's only the narration part and not the analytical part, then I would be concerned. But I think. I sense that there is this, the intention to have both, to make sure that we do have the key terms right, because if we want this to be accepted as translation, then we try to be as accurate as possible.
Thank you. Just in reference to that, in my interaction with Dick over that particular example, my understanding that your concern there was not necessarily for the key term development itself, but the implications on revisions in an oral Bible. My understanding was, okay, I see that is actually exactly how you would do it in a written translation, and later those kind of revisions are really easy. However, in an oral Bible translation setting, that adds complication if you go back later and discover, oh, that's not exactly how we want to do that key term to do the revision. So my understanding is that the concern there was the revision process, not necessarily.
Right, that's correct, yes.
In addition to that, I had another question. I don't know who to throw this out to. Right. In thinking about key terms, I've often thought, is there a place, when you think of the role of the history of Revelation as digging that well that you mentioned? In other words, for example, when we run into the word holy, if you look at it in Revelation chapter 4, where the heavenly beings are crying, holy, 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 right? In terms of the history of Revelation, there has been so much poured into that word, as opposed to the first time we encountered it. And I know it's in a different language, in Hebrew, and when the Lord made the seventh day, blessed the seventh day and made it holy, from that point on, there is a development in my idea of what it means to be holy through the revelation, through God's revelation of himself. And so my understanding is sometimes the way we do translation is often we jump in at a place that is later in Revelation history, and we try to put all that was been poured into, and some that's going to come after, into that term, or what we actually do is look at the end of all the history and try to put that meaning back into an earlier form. So any idea is that relevant in how we do deal with key terms or not?
Great question. I think the one thought is, if you'll forgive me for this, to mention lexical pragmatics and the notion of attributive concepts in the example I gave of fibromyalgia. What I learned from lexical pragmatics is that we need to relax and realize I don't understand what holy means. I can use the word, And so why I say relax is we will never find the word in some other language that gives the full revelation, whatever verse you mentioned, understanding of holy, 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 or even Isaiah 6. All those kinds of things that come to mind when we think about the word holy. What we need is the doorway to the concept, the word or expression that will open the door to building that concept through the canonical process as well as through theological discussion and understanding of the history of the church and the history of Revelation, as you've said. So I think that's my best answer. So, and my apologies for using more than my time. So,
hi, I'm Sofia Tranefelt with SAL Ethiopia, and I'm not a theory lady. I'm more of a practitioner. But Dick, I just wanted to say that you have really verbalized exactly what have been struggling with so much in SAL Ethiopia, how to, with our OBT project, how to reconcile the orality and the translation. And you did it to a point where we're gonna present after lunch, and I'm not sure we need to present anymore because I feel like you already said everything. But I just wanted to say that and express that I'm so happy to hear that there is actually a way that you don't have to choose between these approaches. You can actually choose both.
Well,
So-
that's a point of discussion that I think we need to have because
Yes.
maybe more than our perspective from that.
And that is something that we will continue after lunch if
Right.
anybody's interested in that.
You've just been primed.
One more question we can take.
May I ask a final question? Or maybe give someone else a question, but then I have a final question for Brian at the very end.
Yeah, no, I'm thinking in monolingual situations, like, the situation I learned, Suruaha, it's to find any word, not just the key term, but to find the meaning of any word is a challenge, because you can't just say, how do you say that in your language? There's no way. So what I found out is that for every new word you want to learn, you need to prime, you need to create a situation, you need to tell a story, or you need to be in the situation where you hope that word will be used, and then you find the word. You finally find the term or the word, or you find how they express, that. So my question is, I guess, how is there a way that we can incorporate monolingual learning or monolingual prompting, or in order to find terms instead of asking for translation?
A million thoughts, but hard to articulate one. What you've just expressed, and I think some of my research also throws into question or reinforces the value of an incarnational approach to this work. That the learning of languages and cultures is still an integral part of the process. Not because we come with any magical gifts or whatever, but just because people who are not part of that society come with a different perspective and can sometimes stimulate thought in ways that people embedded in swimming in that the cultural waters don't realize. But I think one of the things that I've realized in this, in a kind of oral approach or a communal discovery approach, yes, you need probably at least one highly bilingual person from the community. But not everyone has to be. Let's encourage the involvement of those who struggle to speak the language of wider communication to be involved. Let's dip into their wells of cultural memory, stimulated by the discussions that the bilingual members of the team would have to take on that responsibility. But I think the oral approach opens the door to the inclusion of more people from the community than a written process does. So that's one thought.
A final question, maybe most difficult question. Did Bill Biffen and his team actually go through the embodied experience of drinking the wine that they had prepared?
You and several others in this room have his email address. You could ask him. I don't know. I know Bill.
What's the difference between embody and imbibe?
I'll let you figure that out. And this is where no comment actually says something. I don't know.
Let's put our hands together once again and break the line.